They thought it was just the wind until the cries started, high, desperate, echoing through the snow-covered forest like a soul calling out from beneath the earth. Two brothers, still grieving their father's sudden death, followed that sound into the freezing dawn. And what they found? It shouldn't have survived. A baby lynx trapped under ice, barely breathing. But why was it there? And how did it cry loud enough to be heard through a frozen lake? This isn't just a rescue story. It's a story of wild instinct, impossible timing, and a bond that defied logic. And it all began with a whisper in the woods. The wind sang low over the Minnesota forest, its breath threading through frost-bitten pines like a whisper. Snow lay thick and undisturbed, blanketing the earth in stillness. It was the kind of morning where time forgot to move, where even the deer tread softly, and the crows kept their calls to themselves. Aidan Hart exhaled, his breath curling into ghostly tendrils before vanishing into the cold. His snowshoes crunched rhythmically behind his brothers, a quiet heartbeat in a world gone white. Then they heard it. A sound that didn't belong, faint, sharp, like the cry of something small and terrified. Lucas halted, head cocked to the side. "Did you hear that?" he murmured, voice muffled by his scarf. Aidan frowned, listening. The forest answered with silence. Then, again, a high-pitched yowl, distant, frantic, muffled, as if trapped. Their eyes met. It came from the east, past the edge of the ravine where the old beaver pond had frozen over in November. The sound was unnatural in its urgency, full of something that twisted in the gut. Not just pain, desperation. Lucas was already moving, veering off the trail into knee-deep snow. Aidan hesitated only a second before following, muscles tense, heartbeat rising. Branches clawed at their jackets as they pushed through underbrush. The sound grew louder, more frantic. They reached the pond's edge. Ice stretched across its surface in a brittle sheet, pale as porcelain. And there, just beneath, a blurred, moving shadow. Tiny, struggling, something was alive under the ice. Lucas dropped to his knees. "Oh my God," he breathed. It's trapped." Aidan stepped forward, the world narrowing to one sound, the sharp, shivering cry echoing through the trees. Then silence. Aidan Hart had always preferred the silence of trees over the comfort of people. It wasn't a mistrust. More like a language he understood better. The creak of birch limbs, the way snowfall quieted the world. These were things that asked nothing of him, which made this hike, in this biting January cold, a peace offering of sorts. Lucas, 3 years older and outwardly steadier, was the one who suggested it. "It's what Dad would have done," he said the night before, while stirring soup over the stovetop. "Get out in the woods. Let the snow knock the grief out of us." Aidan didn't respond at first, just watched the broth swirl, and remembered how their father used to toss dried herbs in with a flick of his wrist, saying healing came from the ground before it ever came from people. It had been 6 weeks, 6 since the aneurysm, swift and silent, 6 since their father's voice fell still. The house still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and juniper. Now they moved through that old forest trail like ghosts retracing someone else's steps. Their father had loved this region of northern Minnesota, not just for its wildness, but for its stories. It was his voice that had first described the lynx as the spirit that walks between. Rarely seen, always listening. He'd spent decades tracking elusive wildlife through these woods as a state biologist. Boots muddy, notebooks filled with paw prints and tree rubs, eyes always scanning. To him, Every trail was a sentence, every broken branch part of a story. Lucas had inherited his way with people, easy laughter, a warmth that opened doors. Aidan, meanwhile, had taken the quiet from him, the need to understand without asking. They hadn't snowshoed this trail in nearly 10 years. The last time, Lucas had dragged a reluctant 18-year-old Aidan up the ridge to watch a lynx disappear into the dusk. Their father had whispered, "You'll never forget the ones who don't need to speak to be heard." Aidan hadn't. That slow blink of gold eyes before the animal melted into shadows had branded something into him. Not fear, not awe, something older. Today's silence felt heavier. Lucas occasionally pointed out tracks. White-tailed deer, a fox maybe. Aidan nodded but said little. The sound they had heard was still ringing in his ears. It had felt like a breach in the ordinary, like something had cracked. They crested a low hill, reaching a break in the tree line. Aidan paused, adjusting the strap of his pack. Below them, the frozen pond glinted dull under the overcast sky, a smear of white framed by cattails and sleeping brush. It was here they used to camp as boys. Their dad would hang food packs high in the pines, make tea from pine needles, and tell them that survival wasn't about strength, it was about attention. "The forest doesn't shout," he'd say. "It whispers. Listen." Aidan crouched by the edge of the pond now, brushing snow from a log. His gloves were stiff with cold. Across the ice, a single crow landed, watching them. Behind it, the woods stretched silent and endless. "I keep thinking he's going to walk out of there," Lucas said quietly, nodding toward the tree line. "Just step out, laugh, tell us we've been reading the tracks wrong." Aidan didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat tightened with a grief too raw for words. All he could do was listen, to the trees, the wind, the faint memory of his father's voice. Then hubbard a sound, there, just beyond the log, soft, muffled, a rustling beneath ice. The cry returned, shorter this time, weak, like the last syllable of a word never meant to be finished. Aidan stood, his pulse suddenly thrumming. Lucas stepped forward too, scanning the frozen pond. And that's when they saw it, a patch near the center. The ice was thinner. A faint ring of cracks spider-webbing outward. Below the surface, blurred by frost and movement, something small writhed. A flick of tail, a paw. Then stillness. Aidan's breath caught. It was alive, barely. Lucas dropped to his knees again, feeling along the edge. "We have to get it out," he said, voice trembling. Their father had always said, "Some animals don't survive alone. When you hear one cry, it means there's still hope." Aidan nodded once, jaw clenched. He stepped onto the frozen edge of the pond, the ice groaning beneath him. In that moment, grief gave way to something else, instinct, focus, urgency. Whatever was trapped beneath the ice had called. And they had heard. The next morning, the rain had softened to mist, and the first light touched the edges of Walt's windows like a whisper. He hadn't slept, not really, just sat in the rocker by the hearth, keeping watch. The kitten hadn't moved much through the night, save for the rise and fall of her breath. Damp and weak, she lay on the towel like something caught between this world and the next. Her fur was matted with pine needles and flecks of dried blood. Tiny cuts marked her legs, her lip. Her left eye blinked slower than the right, but she was alive, somehow, still alive. Walt crouched beside her now, knees groaning, and extended one hand, not to touch, just to be there. His fingers trembled slightly, from the cold or from something deeper. The kitten stirred, her ears twitching. She didn't hiss, just blinked. slow and cautious. "That's it," he murmured. "You made it through the night. Good girl." He wasn't sure when he started calling her that. Maybe because it felt right, maybe because names gave weight to things, made them stay. He brought over a shallow bowl of water and set it down a few feet away. Then a scrap of chicken from last night's stew, torn into slivers. She didn't move at first. Then, a twitch of her nose, a shuffle. She dragged herself closer, moving like a winded fawn. Her tongue flicked out, tentative, tasting. The water went first, then a single bite, then more. Walt exhaled softly, as if he'd been holding that breath since the night before. He stayed there, watching. Not just to be sure she ate, but because something about the moment felt sacred, like watching a star form or the first crack in ice before spring. By noon, she'd made it to the rug near the stove, curling her thin body into a ball. Walt laid out another towel, placed a second bowl beside her. And then he did something that surprised even himself. He talked, not in full sentences at first, just the odd phrase here and there. A muttered observation. "Storm's letting up. That creek's going to be high come nightfall. You've got spirit, little one." And she listened. Not with comprehension, maybe, but with presence. She blinked in rhythm with his voice, turned her head when he moved. When he reached for the kettle, she watched every motion like it mattered. That evening, Walt sat on the porch with his coffee. The rain had given way to clouds, low and soft like worn cotton. He looked out across the trees, watching steam rise from the forest floor. There was something ancient about the way mist clung to the ferns, the way light filtered down in ribbons through mossy branches. He felt the pull of it, that wildness, that ache. And he wondered, what if she'd never cried out? What if he'd stayed inside, let nature be? But the truth pressed heavier than the what-ifs. She had cried out. And he had answered. Back inside, the lynx had found the corner near the woodbox. She lay there now, chest rising slow and even, her tail short and thick, flicked once at a falling ember. Walt smiled. "She's got fight," he whispered, half to himself, half to the air. He didn't call the rangers, not that day, not the next. He rationalized it, told himself it was temporary, just until she could stand on her own, just until she regained her strength. But as the days passed, it became harder to imagine the cabin without her in it. Not because she demanded space, she didn't. She moved like a ghost, silent and light-footed. She slept most of the day, stretched long across the rug. But her presence, it shifted something. Walt began to rise earlier, not just from habit, but from want. He cleaned more, cooked better meals, read aloud sometimes, just to fill the quiet. "You need a name," he said one morning as she sat blinking beside the window. The word came like a memory. Kiva. He'd heard it on a reservation patrol years ago, a Hopi word. It meant a shelter, a chamber of prayer, of safety. "You're protected," he told her. "And maybe you're protecting me too." Kiva, she wore it like a secret. By the end of the week, she was walking again, lopsided at first, then surer. She explored the cabin with a quiet curiosity, sniffing every corner, brushing her whiskers against each worn baseboard. Her favorite spot became the narrow windowsill above the sink, where the sun touched just right in the mornings. Walt watched her grow each day, not just in strength, but in certainty. Her eyes, once clouded by fear, now held something more, awareness, presence, a question unspoken. He built a makeshift perch from old firewood, lined it with wool. He left the back door unlatched, just in case she wanted out. She didn't take it, not yet. Outside, the snow came early. Frost laced the edges of the windows. Walt split extra wood. Kiva followed him around the yard, pausing every few feet to sniff a branch or paw at a snowdrift. Once, she chased a leaf until her back legs slipped and she tumbled into a pile of cedar needles. Walt laughed so hard he scared a crow from the eaves. That night, she curled beside the stove, her breath slow and even. Walt lay in bed, listening. The wind had died, the world outside was still, and for the first time in years, so was he. The heater whirred louder as the truck bounced along the forest road, its tires clawing at the snowy gravel. Aidan sat in the back seat now, cradling the lynx kitten wrapped in his thermal coat. Lucas kept glancing in the rearview mirror, eyes flickering between the winding path ahead and the fragile creature in his brother's arms. They'd called ahead, a ranger station about 10 miles out, manned year-round by wildlife volunteers and equipped with a small medical bay for injured animals. Mia Torres had answered the radio herself. "You've got a lynx kitten in hypothermic shock?" "Yes." Aidan's voice had been steady. "She's barely hanging on." "Keep her wrapped tight. No sudden movements. Don't force her awake. Just keep her breathing." Now, as the truck jostled over a frozen pothole, Aidan tightened his grip instinctively. The kitten's head lolled against his arm, ear tufts twitching faintly. Her fur, though damp, had begun to fluff out slightly from the heat. He could feel a tremor pulsing through her. Slow, rhythmic. "She's still shivering," Aidan murmured. "That's good," Lucas said, eyes on the road. "Means she's fighting." The snow had turned to a light flurry. As they turned off the main road and climbed the hill toward the ranger outpost, Aidan watched the sky. It had shifted to a dull lavender hue, like the world was holding its breath. The station came into view, a log-sided building nestled between two steep ridges. Smoke curled from the chimney. The porch light glowed amber in the winter dusk. Mia was waiting at the door, a flannel blanket in one arm, a portable heating pad in the other. She was in her 30s, bundled in a weatherproof parka, her dark hair pulled back in a braid. Her eyes, though, were what struck Aidan, calm and piercing, the eyes of someone who'd seen wild things fight for their lives before. "Bring her in," she said without preamble, already moving to clear the bench by the hearth. Inside, the warmth hit like a wave. The air smelled of cedar and dried herbs. Aidan laid the kitten down gently on the blanket Mia had spread across a padded table. She moved swiftly, checking pupils, feeling for pulse, unwrapping the limbs with careful precision. "She's cold, but not rigid. That's good." Mia's voice was soft, but purposeful. "She's probably around 8 weeks. Slight dehydration. Paws are scratched up, but not broken." "She fell through ice," Lucas said. "Was trapped under it. We heard her crying." Mia paused, glancing up at them. "You heard a lynx cry from the woods and followed it?" Aidan nodded. It sounded wrong, like a question. Mia turned back to her work. Most people would have kept walking. She wrapped a second layer of fleece around the kitten, placing the heating pad beneath her body. She started a slow drip of warmed electrolyte solution along the inside of her mouth with a tiny dropper. The lynx let out a faint murmur, barely more than breath. Aidan stepped back, suddenly unsure of his place. The room felt too still, too sacred. "She'll need time," Mia said, keeping her eyes on the kitten. "But she has a shot." Lucas let out a long breath. "We named her Echo." Mia looked up again, this time with something softer behind her eyes. "Echo," she repeated. "Fitting." She adjusted the lighting in the room, dimmed it until only the firelight and one small lamp glowed. The shadows shifted around them, warm and deep. Aidan sat down on the floor nearby, knees pulled up, jacket still damp from the rescue. For a long while, none of them spoke. Then softly, Mia said, "I lost a lynx 2 winters ago, caught in a snare. By the time someone found her, it was too late." She had those same eyes. "What kind of eyes?" Aidan asked. Mia didn't look up.
"The kind that look back, like they see more than you think." He nodded slowly. That was exactly it. Echo hadn't panicked when he pulled her from the ice. She hadn't fought, just stared, quiet, pleading, ancient. "She called to us," Aidan whispered, "and we answered." From the table, Echo stirred. One ear flicked. Then, against all odds, a sound, not a cry, not a whimper, a soft, guttural chirp, alive, present. Mia looked up, eyes shining. "She's coming back."
The days that followed folded into each other like snowfall on pine limbs, quiet, slow, almost sacred. The ranger station, usually a waypoint for injured deer or orphaned raccoons, had become a kind of monastery, a place of watching, of waiting. Echo slept through most of the first 24 hours, her body slowly absorbing warmth like moss-soaking sun. Mia monitored her constantly, waking every 2 hours to feed her broth through a rubber syringe and check her vitals. Aidan stayed too, sleeping on the worn leather couch by the fire, coat still smelling faintly of pine and melted snow. "She's holding on," Mia would murmur, each time Echo blinked or stirred or shifted her paw. Lucas returned to town briefly to bring back clothes and Aidan's camera, though it remained untouched on the table. Every time Aidan looked at it, he thought, "This isn't something I want to capture. It's something I need to feel." By the 3rd morning, Echo was strong enough to sit up. Mia had crafted a soft enclosure using fleece blankets and a shallow crate. Echo's tiny body was nestled inside it like a secret, ears perked, eyes wide. She was still silent, but no longer helpless. She blinked slowly at Aidan as he approached, her breath fogging the clear side of the crate. He sat cross-legged beside it, lowering his face to her level. "You should be in the wild," he whispered. "But I'm glad you're here." Her paw twitched. That afternoon, Mia stepped outside to refill the woodpile. Aidan stayed behind, watching Echo drift between alertness and rest. There was a gentle knock at the door. He opened it to find a ranger courier standing with a clipboard and a hard-sided case. "For the kitten," the man said. "Transfer crate. We've been told she's going to Duluth Rehab Center by end of week." Aidan's stomach tightened. He nodded, signed, and took the crate inside. When Mia returned, he was still staring at it. "She's being moved?" Mia pulled off her gloves and rubbed her arms. "Yes, standard protocol. They've got a team of specialists there, fencing acreage, other lynx kits. It's where she'll relearn how to be wild." He didn't speak. Mia crossed the room, her voice gentler. "I know. You pulled her out of the ice, but it's not where she stays." "I know that." His voice cracked. They stood in silence for a while. Then Mia said, "Want to help me prep her?" So they did. Together, they massaged her paws with salve to soothe the cracked pads. They combed the knots from her damp fur, brushing gently around her belly and hind legs. Mia clipped the tiniest burrs from the soft down under her jaw, and Aidan whispered nonsense to her the whole time. How snow tastes different on Tuesday mornings, how some trees remember you when you lean on them just right. When they placed her back in her crate, she was stronger, watching them both with those glacier blue eyes. That night, Lucas returned and brought a bundle from their father's old field kit. Inside was a faded journal, worn along the edges, pages filled with penciled sketches, footprints, scat samples, scrawled notes in the margins. Aidan opened it carefully, the scent of old paper rising like dust off a trail. In the middle pages was a sketched lynx labelled Spirit Walker, Female Juvenile, January Sighting, Unusual Proximity to Humans. Underneath, in faded graphite, some animals don't hide to disappear, they hide to be found by the right person. Aidan closed the journal, heart thudding. They left it in Echo's crate that night, beside her fleece and the small leather feather charm Mia had tied to the corner. She curled beside it, as if the scent carried memory. "You know," Mia said softly from across the room, "lynx are solitary by nature, but every now and then one bonds, briefly, deeply." Aidan looked at her. "How do you know when that happens?" "They don't run when they should." That night, just before dawn, the fire burned low. Aidan stirred from the couch to find Echo standing, her legs shaky but deliberate. She looked at him, then climbed out of the fleece nest and padded slowly to the edge of the crate. Her eyes searched the room, then fixed on the journal beside her. She placed her paw on it, then looked at him again. The gesture was almost imperceptible. But in that silence, it felt like thunder. Outside, the wind had quieted. The flurries slowed. Inside the ranger station, time became a hush. Echo slept again, curled into a circle of fur, her flank rising and falling with the rhythm of something reclaimed. Mia had gone upstairs to rest. Lucas had stretched out on a cot near the wood stove, one arm flung over his face. Aidan remained where he always did, beside the crate. Not touching, not calling, just present. The kind of silence his father had always spoken of. The kind that fills you, not empties you. Echo stirred once in her sleep, ears twitching at some dream. Aidan leaned his head against the crate's wooden edge and let his thoughts drift. He thought of his father's voice, gentle but firm, teaching them how to track scat, how to listen for the subtle cough of a snowshoe hare, how to notice when the forest changed. He remembered the story about the lynx who vanished for 4 winters and returned with a scar over her left eye, and how their dad had said, "Some creatures leave, but they don't always mean to stay gone." He hadn't spoken much since the funeral. Words felt brittle in his mouth like twigs underfoot. But tonight, something unspooled. "Hey," he whispered to Echo, not knowing if she could hear him, not needing her to. "It's stupid, but when we lost him, I thought I'd feel something shift."
Like some part of the world would break. He blinked. The fire crackled softly. But it didn't. Not really. It just kept snowing, kept going. That made it worse, somehow. Echo didn't move, but the crate felt warmer. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet long enough, I'd hear him again. A pause. "I haven't. But you cried out, and we heard." He looked down. "You brought something back." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt thick, weighted. Then a whisper of movement.
Echo, without lifting her head, slowly extended one paw, resting it along the edge of the crate nearest to Aidan's folded arms. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his breath caught, and a tear, quiet and unannounced, slipped down his cheek. Just before dawn, a pale ribbon of light crept over the horizon, turning the windows of the ranger station to soft mirrors of frost. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting long, sleepy shadows across the floorboards. Mia stirred first. She came down the stairs wrapped in a blanket, her braid loose, footsteps soundless. She stopped at the crate, then smiled. "Look." Aidan, who hadn't really been asleep, sat up slowly. Lucas blinked awake across the room. All three turned to the quiet space in the center of the room where Echo sat. Not curled, not hidden, but upright. She wasn't shaking anymore. Her fur had dried into a halo of soft down around her face. Her ears, alert now, twitched at the sounds of the waking world, the drip of melting snow from the eaves, the creak of settling wood. Her eyes met Aiden's, clear and blue and full of something deeper than instinct. A long moment passed between them. She didn't move, just watched. And then, with a stillness so intentional it felt rehearsed, she blinked. Not a flinch, not a twitch, a slow, deliberate blink. Mia drew in a breath. That's trust. Aiden nodded, barely able to speak. It's acknowledgement. Echo leaned forward, stretched her forelegs with a kittenish wobble, then sat back again, present, composed, not quite wild, not quite tame, between worlds. The moment ended as softly as it had begun. Echo yawned, delicate fangs flashing, then curled her tail around her paws like a crown. She looked down at the old field journal still resting inside the crate, then returned her gaze to the room. No fear, just awareness. She was no longer surviving. She was choosing to stay. 2 months later, the snow was beginning to recede. In the high northern woods that meant the pines shed their cloaks of white in great avalanches, the rivers began whispering again beneath the ice, and small patches of stubborn grass emerged like old memories. Echo had grown. No longer a bundle of bone and frostbite, she moved with a quiet grace, lighter on her paws, muscles coiled beneath her silvered coat. The soft tufts on her ears had lengthened, and her eyes had deepened into a shade of glacier blue that seemed older than her months. She knew her name now. She responded not with obedience, but with orientation. When Mia called, Echo would appear, pausing at the tree line or the edge of the enclosure, as if to say, "I heard you. I'm still here." Aiden had spent much of that time volunteering at the station, quietly helping with tasks he never announced, splitting wood, restocking feed, charting prints in the snow. But it was clear who he was there for. He never pushed closeness. He didn't try to make her a pet. He simply stayed. And Echo, in her own way, allowed it. She began following him during supervised walks, just out of reach, never leashed. Once, she brought him a pine cone and dropped it at his boot before disappearing into the underbrush again. Mia watched it all with quiet understanding. She'd seen wild things attach before, but rarely had she seen a bond like this, built not on taming, but on timing. She was waiting, she said one afternoon, as Aiden stood watching Echo scale a fallen log. Not for food, for someone who wouldn't cage her with care. Aiden didn't reply, but his eyes said everything. Now it was time. The final assessment had been completed. Echo's instincts had returned. She hunted mice released in the soft pen, tracked scents through snowfall, and reacted to strange sounds with measured caution. She was ready. A wildlife officer from Duluth arrived with release papers and a reinforced carrier, but Mia declined to use it. "She'll walk," she said. "Let her choose her last steps here." They drove out together, Mia, Aiden, and Echo, into the northern boundary forest, deep into the protected corridor where few roads reached. Lucas had offered to come, but Aiden had quietly shaken his head. "This is something I need to do." The truck stopped at a clearing ringed with firs, where the last snow was melting in small, glistening pools. Pine needles blanketed the forest floor in a soft hush. A distant woodpecker called once, then fell silent. Aiden opened the back door. Echo waited, then stepped out, slow and sure, her paws sinking slightly into the moss. She paused beside Mia, brushed her flank against the hem of her coat, then moved forward. She reached the edge of the clearing and stopped. Aidan approached, his breath catching. He reached into his coat pocket and removed something small, a worn, leather-bound field journal, his father's. He knelt, placed it at the base of a pine tree and whispered, "She's yours now." Echo sniffed the journal, then looked up at him. Her head tilted slightly, eyes soft, unreadable. She blinked. Once. Then turned. She didn't run. She walked, gracefully, deliberately, between two fir trunks and into the forest beyond. The trees folded around her like old friends. One moment she was there. The next she was gone. The silence afterward was absolute. Aidan remained kneeling beside the journal, wind rustling his jacket, the forest holding its breath. Mia stood a few steps back, watching without speaking. He exhaled. "She's going to be okay." Mia nodded. She was always going to be. But she left something behind. A single feather, tangled in one of the pine branches overhead, drifted loose and landed beside the journal. Aidan picked it up, held it gently in his palm, then let it go. They hiked back in silence. No words were needed. The forest spoke enough. The trees, tall and unmoving, offered their shadows. The wind curled through bare branches like a lullaby remembered from childhood. With every step, the snow melted a little more beneath their boots. Aidan walked slightly behind Mia, his breath slower now. Less of a guard, more of a rhythm. Somewhere to the west, Echo was weaving her way into a life she was meant for. Not the life she'd been forced into when the ice cracked beneath her paws, nor the fragile days that followed, but the one waiting deep in the thickets, in solitude, in instinct, in the place she was always meant to return to. Back at the station, Lucas waited. He greeted them on the porch, eyes scanning Aidan's face. "She gone?" Aidan nodded. Lucas stepped forward, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. They didn't speak of grief or goodbye, just stood together under the slow fading sky. Later, as dusk settled in and the stove crackled again, Aidan sat at the table by the window. He reached for a fresh page in his father's journal, the back cover still dusted with pine needles, and began to write, not notes, not data, a story of snow, of a sound that pierced the silence, of a creature with eyes like a winter lake, and of a bond that didn't try to possess, only protect. Outside, a breeze passed through the clearing, lifting a loose feather from the porch rail. It floated for a moment, caught in the air like memory, before drifting out into the trees. The camera remained untouched on the shelf. This story didn't need footage, just presence, just listening. If this story touched your heart, stay close. Here on Paw Prints and Stories, we believe some bonds never end.